Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, if a certain referendum had gone a bit differently, Scotland would be an independent country in just 10 days' time, March the 24th to be precise. Those wanting to leave the UK didn't win that argument in 2014, but that hasn't dented the fortunes of the SNP. It's riding high north of the border. It's the party's spring conference in Glasgow this weekend. We're joined now from there by the First Minister for Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. Welcome to the Sunday Politics.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you, Andrew.
Thank you. Now, if the referendum had gone your way, we'd be 10 days from independence. You'd be taking a massive and unsustainable £15 billion budget deficit, 10% of Scotland's GDP. What would you be doing to get that deficit down?
Well, we would be dealing with it in the same way that the UK dealt with its deficit in 2009-10 when they had £153 billion, 10.2% of their GDP. Countries suffer deficits, but what we would be doing is building on the underlying fundamental strengths of the Scottish economy. If you look at the last 10 years, our fiscal position has been broadly similar to the rest of the UK. Some years it has been much better than the rest of the UK's. Our onshore revenues are growing at a faster rate than the fall in offshore revenues. We've got higher employment than the UK right now, faster productivity growth. So our economy is fundamentally strong, and that would have been a very good basis on which to become an independent country.
Didn't you oppose most of the efforts of the British government to get the deficit down?
I oppose many of the measures that George Osborne has taken. I don't for a second say that we shouldn't try to get the deficit down. I have opposed and continue to oppose both the speed at which that is happening and the way in which that is happening. But I don't think anybody would deny that countries want to get their fiscal positions into a more stable position than the UK's is in just now. The point I'm making is that Scotland's economy is a fundamentally strong economy, and much of what I've just said to you there illustrates that point.
Well, let's look at some of the things you've just said. You say that most countries have deficits, but can you name any other advanced economy, any European Union economy, 8 years after the financial crash, that has a budget deficit of 10% of GDP?
You don't look at the fiscal position of a country on the strength of just 1 year's figures. If I go back to, say, 2008-9, the UK's relative deficit was double that of Scotland's. In 4 out of the last 10 years, our fiscal position has been stronger. It's not right now because of the particular issues that are being faced in the North Sea.
Is it not the case, First Minister, that Scotland's deficit now is the highest in the European Union? That's true, isn't it?
In the year that we had figures published for just in this past week, we have a very challenging and difficult set of figures. I'm not denying that for a second.
It's the highest.
What I'm saying is no country, whether it's the UK, whether it's Scotland, whether it's any other EU country, makes judgments about the fiscal strength of that country on the strength of 1 year's figures. And the point I'm making is that over the past 10 years, our fiscal position has been broadly similar to the UK's, and in some of those years, it has been significantly better. If we project forward for the next 5 years, because I accept the future is much more important in these respects than the past, our onshore revenues are likely to vastly outstrip the decline in offshore revenues. So I'm not denying the difficulties in the North Sea, and those are difficulties principally for the people who work in the North Sea and for the economy of the northeast of Scotland, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the economy of Scotland is fundamentally a strong one.
Well, let's look at more than 1 year, because you've said it's just 1 year, a snapshot. But without oil revenues, and there are almost no oil revenues now, without oil revenues, Scotland has run a persistent budget deficit of over 10% every year for 13 years. You have a systemic deficit problem.
Looking back at the last number of years, why should you not look at oil revenues? Oil revenues are there and have been contributing to the Treasury to the tune of £300 billion.
But they're not there now, and without them you run a persistent budget deficit. You have done for 13 years.
This is the point I'm going to come on to make, because I accept that it's the future that matters more than the past. So if you look at the projections for the next 5 years, our onshore revenues, and remember, more than 90% of the Scottish economy comes from onshore, not from offshore. If you look at the 5 years ahead, then our onshore revenues are projected to grow in the region of £14 billion. That's many, many times the fall in offshore revenues for that period. So I'm not for a second denying the challenge of North Sea, and other countries, Norway for example, are facing exactly the same challenges because they're better prepared for it, because they've stewarded their oil resources better. Norway just in the last couple of weeks drew down on its massive oil fund for the first time. So what I'm saying is, with the powers that independence would have given us and we didn't vote yes, we'd have had much greater ability to grow that onshore economy even faster.
Well, let's look at the onshore revenues. If the Scottish economy is so strong, why are onshore revenues, that is revenues excluding oil, tax revenues, why are they growing less strongly in Scotland than the rest of the UK?
That's a long-standing issue. One of the issues at the heart of that is asset price growth in the City of London. But what we're seeing is a narrowing of some of that long-standing gap that there's been between aspects of the Scottish economy and aspects of the UK economy. If you take productivity, for example, for a long, long time, Scotland lagged significantly behind the rest of the UK. Over the past few years, we've closed that gap significantly. We still lag behind some of our European competitors, and that's our challenge now, to get productivity matching our closest European competitors. So I'm not standing here denying the challenges that the Scottish economy has, in the same way you've just been talking about the Chancellor's budget, in the same way that the UK economy has challenges and economies across the European Union have challenges. The point I'm making is that there are real strengths in the Scottish economy, and the big question should be how we build on and accentuate those big strengths.
But it's hard to see the onshore revenues making up the whole gap with the loss of oil revenues. I mean, revenues per person in Scotland were £10,700 in years 11-12. They're now £10,000, 700 less, even with the growth in onshore revenues. The offshore has offset that. You still have a fundamental deficit problem.
We have a debt. I'm not denying we've got a deficit, Andrew. The UK has a deficit. Most countries across the developed world have a deficit.
The size of yours is the problem.
Per head. OK, but take revenues per head of population, which is what you've just cited to me there. In the most recent year, our revenues per head of population were broadly similar to the UK's. In every single other one of the past 35 years, revenues per head of population in Scotland have been higher than the rest of the UK. Now, I accept that we've got a challenge in the North Sea. I accept that, like all oil-producing countries, we've got questions and challenges about how we transition away from oil and gas over the years to come, although there's still a great deal of potential in the North Sea. But these are challenges we should embrace. These are challenges we should be working out how we face up to and address. And Scotland is doing that, and would and will do that on the basis of fundamental strengths in our economy. Right.
So we've established that in terms of per capita tax, Scotland pays about the same as the UK average. So there's no difference there. The difference is...
No, in every...
Well, I'm talking about the current year.
In most of the last...
Yeah, but in the current year it's...
But what I'm saying is you cannot judge the economy in 1 year. It's similar in 1 year.
Right.
In 34 of the past 35 years it's been higher. That's the point I was making.
But we are where we are now. The reason you're running a deficit is because per capita spending is so much higher in Scotland. It's £1,400 higher public spending per person. And Westminster foots that bill. It's the difference between your tax revenues and what you spend. You wouldn't be able to do it if it wasn't for Westminster.
It's a deficit. The UK is in deficit. Scotland is in deficit.
The Scottish deficit is twice as big, First Minister. It's twice as big.
But in 2008-9, the UK's deficit was twice as big as Scotland's. It will vary from year to year. But in terms of the point about per capita spending, there are very good reasons, as anybody who knows Scotland well, as you certainly do, for that difference. We have a country where 1 in 5 of our population lives in a rural and remote community. I was Health Secretary for 5 years. It costs much more to deliver health services on an island or rural community than it does here in the Central Belt in the city of Glasgow.
But it's Westminster that pays for that. It makes up the difference. Whereas if you were independent, you would either have to raise taxes or cut spending. What would it be if you had to make that up yourself? By how much would you raise taxes and by how much would you cut spending?
Look, we set a budget in Devolve Scotland every year. We make choices. Sometimes these are tough choices. If Scotland was independent, we would do that as well. But the point I'm making to you here is that the economy of an independent Scotland would face challenges like other economies do, but we're in a fundamentally strong position. Employment is higher than any other nation in the UK right now. As I said earlier on, productivity is growing faster. We've got a number of key strengths in our economy, and one of the challenges is how we build on these strengths and get our onshore economy growing even faster. We've got a number of world-leading sectors in our economy. Let's get on with the job of growing them.
But let me just look at that, because you say 1 year. The fact is that your deficit was £15 billion, even with oil revenues at £2 billion in the last financial year. This year, oil revenues are reckoned to be close to zero. So your budget deficit would get even worse. Now, I put it to you again, to cut your deficit to anything like acceptable levels, you would either have to increase tax by 16% or cut spending by 14%, or a combination of the two. What would it be?
We would deal with the deficit in the same way that the UK is dealing with a deficit and dealt with a deficit in 2009-10 that was 10% of its GDP. I hope we take better decisions than some of those that George Osborne has taken, but we would be in the same position as many other countries, but we'd be in a position where we've got a fundamentally strong economy. Now, I wish Scotland had voted yes in 2014. It didn't. If it had done, we'd have spent the last almost 2 years preparing for Scotland becoming independent. The figures in GERS would not have been exactly the figures we were dealing with, because in a negotiation around independence there would have been discussions about assets and liabilities, debt interest, the share of defence spending. So that's what would have been the case if we had voted for independence. But looking ahead, Andrew, we've got a strong economy, and the challenge is how we grow it even faster.
You offered Scotland independence within the EU. You accept, surely, that you wouldn't be allowed to join the European Union with a 10% deficit. You would have to agree to a Brussels austerity programme, correct?
Look, we're getting into some ridiculous territory here, and we're getting into one of the most ridiculous arguments. So, well, I'll tell you if you let me finish, because Scotland wouldn't have been out of the EU. We wouldn't have been in the position of an accession state. Now, it's a bit rich, I have to say, for anybody, given where we are right now, with the prospect of being taken out of the EU looming ahead of us, for anybody to start to scaremonger about the prospects of an independent Scotland within the European Union.
I mean, the truth is that with 2 weeks to go to independence, instead of increases in public spending, which you announced yesterday,
well, we're not 2 weeks to go to independence,
but
Andrew,
if it had been,
we didn't vote yes.
But if it had been, you would at the moment be looking at a list of hospitals and schools to close, nurses and teachers to sack. You would be the austerity party. That's what you would have to do.
That's ridiculous. That's just ridiculous. Countries the world over have deficits and deal with those deficits. We would also have been taking on the greater powers to grow our economy, particularly our onshore economy.
Italy and Greece had 10% deficits, and you know the austerity they had to go through.
Come on. See, I really do think this argument starts to tip over into being completely incredible when we start to compare Scotland, with all of the strength of the Scottish economy, to countries like Greece and Italy. I've just cited figures to you about the fundamental strengths of our economy, not least the fact that we've now had the longest period of economic growth since devolution. We've got higher employment than any other part of the UK.
You've said all that.
Yes, we've got challenges. We're not alone in that, but Scotland has got a strong economy.
If it is so strong, why do your revenues lag your spending by £2,400 per person? Why, if it's so strong, have you got such an enormous deficit?
We've got a deficit like many other countries. We've got a particular issue just now because of the fall.
No one has a deficit like Scotland's.
We've got a particular issue because of the fall in North Sea revenues. I actually think it's not an indictment of the case for independence, it's an indictment of Westminster mismanagement, that unlike Norway, we don't have a massive oil fund to help us deal with that.
They're paying for your deficit.
We also have a fundamentally strong economy.
Westminster's paying for your deficit, Mrs Sturgeon. Westminster's paying for the difference for the rest of the deficit. Would you like to thank the rest of the people of the United Kingdom for making up for the deficit you've got?
Westminster has got a deficit of its own. It's £1 trillion
yours.
in debt. So that's not the case.
No, that's not
Scotland's
the
in
deficit. That's the
like
debt,
Westminster's
First
in
Minister.
deficit like other countries.
That's not the
I
deficit.
absolutely know. That's why I said debt, Andrew. I understand the difference between deficit and debt, but it has an accumulated debt of £1 trillion. It has an annual deficit, just like Scotland and many other countries do.
All right. It's actually 1.5 trillion. It's even worse than you think, Minister. But thanks for joining us.
See,
Nicola
I was
Sturgeon.
being kind to them, Andrew.
Well, you should be kind, because they are sending you quite a bit of money. Thank you.
I've been